range of national and institutional contexts, as well as a diverse range of academic disciplines, languages of translation, texts and genres, and it also brings together traditional scholars and as well as translation practitioners. So what I'd like to do now is just share the table of contents with you, as it might be the easiest way of showing you, just a moment if I can find it, of showing you an overview of the book and the contributions inside it. So here you can see that the book is actually divided into two parts. Sorry for the small print, but hopefully you can see the book contains 14 contributions in total. And so it's part 1, the reading of translations, dissemination and reception studies. And part 2 is the making of translations, voices of translators. So part 1, we've got 9 contributions. And I think I saw in the audience, one of our contributors, Sophie, who wrote chapter 8, is here with us in the audience. So thank you for coming. And the 9 chapters in part 1 comprise really diverse scholarship on the translation of classical Chinese literature. And then we have part 2, which presents 5 chapters written by translators themselves. So translators who write about their process of translating classical Chinese texts from various genres into Danish, Czech, and English. So as you can probably tell, a major feature of this volume is the diversity of the contributions. And you can notice by looking at the author affiliation column here that the scholars come from all corners of the globe, from Asia, of course, from Australia, from the US, and from Europe. And since the majority of research in this field has been done in China and published in Chinese, we hope that this could be an impetus for greater dialogue between scholars both within and outside of China. So the volume can showcase some insights that stem from different national contexts and different academic traditions. And on the latter point about different academic conventions, the contributors' disciplinary backgrounds are also quite diverse. We have a mix of translation studies researchers as well as Chinese studies scholars. And this has led to a range of different approaches in the chapters, some of which are more theoretical, others are more historical and archival studies and so on. So by bringing together scholars with different methodologies and different academic conventions based on their common interest in translation and dissemination of classical Chinese literature, we're really trying to open up interdisciplinary conversations that are mutually beneficial. And some of the contributions are very heavily annotated with numerous citations, while others are more reminiscent of like a reflective essay. And it's very interesting to read these pieces side by side. Many studies of Chinese works in translation focus on English translation. So we also made a conscious effort to try and expand the book's coverage of different languages. So 6 out of the 14 contributions discuss texts that are translated into languages other than English. So this includes Japanese, French, Danish, and Czech. And as for the texts themselves, you can see here that there are quite a wide range of texts and genres from different historical periods. We've presented them in part 1 in reverse chronological order. And again, instead of uniformity, we've really sought to bring diversity into this volume in the case studies as well, including some quite eclectic or niche areas. And another way in which we attempt to advocate for diversity in this volume is to bridge the gap between translation practice and translation research through the inclusion of translators' personal reflections in part 2. And despite the ongoing, I guess, hesitation among academia to recognize translation as research, it is very clear when you read these translator reflections that these translators have in fact engaged in a very in-depth and ongoing process of research, which has informed each and every translation choice, as well as their very insightful commentaries on their translations. So he wanted to provide, I guess, a dedicated forum for voices of these scholar translators to be heard, and also to highlight the academic value of their work. And these contributions also function as an important paratext and interpretive aids for readers of their translations. They then enhance the status and visibility of the translators, and they also act as data for future scholars who might be interested in investigating the motivations of the translators or the methodologies and approaches. I would like just to note here that translation studies colleagues in the translation studies department here at Monash does now have quite a history of valuing and advocating for translation as practice-based research. You may know there are 2 other volumes edited by Rick as well as other colleagues at Monash, which includes sections for critical reflections by translators. And Monash is also home to the editors of the Literature Review. This is the peer-reviewed journal of the Australian Association for Literary Translation. And the Literature Review publishes translation plus commentary as a standard format, together with traditional articles. And as well as this, we also have a long-standing practice-based PhD in translation studies at Monash. Students who take part in this PhD undertake a 40,000 word translation, and this is accompanied by a 40,000 word critical exegesis. So very much practice-based research, and students in our coursework master's program also have the opportunity to do a translation project, which is like a smaller scale version of this. I'll just go back to my slides for a moment. Okay, so just to finish off with, I'd like to highlight some of the common themes or threads that can be identified in many of the contributions to this volume, relating to the factors that have influenced the translation and dissemination and reception of classical Chinese texts. Many of the chapters emphasize the role of the socio-historical context, such as issues to do with censorship, social mores, ideology, politics, religion, and so on, in shaping translation choices and in the dissemination of translations. Some of these are diachronic studies of translations and retranslations, which demonstrate these changes over time, which are very interesting. And we can also see how different characteristics of the target audiences in different time periods and locations have motivated retranslations or adaptations that cater to particular readerships. Many of the studies also discuss the role of patronage and the publishing industry in promoting Chinese literature and translation. Several of the contributions in the volume shine the spotlight directly on the translators themselves, and not only those written by the translators, but also those which conduct archival studies and rely on paratexts and other historical documentation to discern the background, the motivations and the habitus of the translators, analysing how these influenced translation choices at both the macro and micro levels. And through this research, we can certainly see that translating Chinese literatures is an in-depth, scholarly, and often collaborative process, with translators frequently working closely with sinologists and other translators who have complementary skill sets. They engage with both previous translations and evolving research, and then articulate a particular interpretation of the text through their translations. And in doing so, they show how they need to make many decisions based on the nature of their target audience, such as the handling of cultural and historical aspects, and for example, the extent of annotations to include and so on. And regarding specific translation issues, a number of the chapters discuss translation strategies at a textual level, which unsurprisingly is a key focus of the translator contributors in part 2. And these include approaches to, for example, translating erotic content, register, linguistic polyphony, proper nouns, poetry, and many more. And in reflecting on how they formulated their translation strategies, we can see that the translators are very aware of their own ethics and relationship with their target audience. So I'll conclude here, and I hope this has helped provide a bit of an overview to the contributions in the book. And so now I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Rick, who will discuss the specific case study in chapter 7.
Thanks, Shani. I'll just share my screen. All right. Thanks, Shani, and hi, everyone. Thanks for attending this seminar, the book talk during your semester break. Much appreciated. Shani just gave an overview of the edited volume, including its key principles and major features, followed by an introduction to its division of parts and chapters. And in what follows, I will make a more micro-level presentation by focusing on the chapter co-authored by Shani and myself as a case study. The title of the chapter is Japanese Translations of Jinping Mei, Chinese Sexuality in the Sociocultural Context of Japan. And the research for this chapter was generously supported by the Jiang Jingguo Foundation Research Grants Program. Now, I would like to quickly cover these few topics. So I'll start by providing some contextual information about this research, and then go through the translational history of Jinping Mei in Japan, covering the Edo period, the Meiji period, and to the post-war era. And the more theoretical analysis, of course, can be found in the chapter itself. But in this presentation, I'll try to just provide a more paratextual overview of the translation history of Jinping Mei in Japan. Firstly, why Jinping Mei? The selection of Japanese translations of Jinping Mei for research was a natural step for me. My PhD research was on Jinping Mei's translation and dissemination in the Anglophone world. Jinping Mei researchers used to believe there were only 3 English versions of Jinping Mei. But during my PhD, I discovered that there are more than 10 translations and adaptations. This prompted me to wonder about Jinping Mei's circulation in other countries, such as Japan, given the very long history of literary exchange between China and Japan, and given that the other novels contemporaneous to Jinping Mei, such as Shui Hu Zhuan and Sanguo Yan Yi, have been translated into Japanese multiple times and from a quite early date. So I decided to shift my focus to the Japanese context by largely adopting the same approach as in my PhD research. And this was made possible with the collaboration with Shani, who has got an extensive expertise in Japanese language, literature, and culture. Academically, we hoped to get to the bottom of why Jinping Mei has not been as popular in Japan as the other masterpieces of Ming Dynasty. Now that literary merits of Jinping Mei were recognized by the Ming literati, such as Feng Menglong, and was named the #1 marvelous book by the Qing critic Zhang Zhupo. There has been a long-held saying in Japan that because of Jinping Mei's pornographic reputation, it was not considered a worthy book to be read publicly by any gentleman, and especially not to be read by women, based on prejudice against women, of course, in the old times. Indeed, the saying was so popular and widespread that when Hayashi Fuso published his version of Jinping Mei in the 1960s, it gave the series of its translation a subtitle, "Women Should Not Read." But does that assessment tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth? Particularly when we think of the relative popularity and prosperity of artistic expressions of sexuality in the early Edo period. Actually, the Edo period saw the publication of a large number of shunga, erotic paintings, and erotic novels, such as The Life of an Amorous Man and The Life of an Amorous Woman. It was also recorded in the writings of foreign visitors at the time that it was pretty normal and natural for naked Japanese men to enter brothels during daytime. And in such sociocultural context, the lack of Japanese translation of Jinping Mei can hardly be attributed to its pornographic reputation. According to the Japanese scholar Yuko Kawashima, the reason why Jinping Mei was not popular among translators during the Edo period was that the language of Jinping Mei was so complex and esoteric that translators of the time were not capable of producing a functional translation. She discovered that during the Edo period, there were reading clubs on Jinping Mei in which people met to discuss the language of the novel and make annotations on its linguistic expressions and cultural elements. She also pointed out that the intelligentsia was open about their appreciation of the Chinese erotic novel. The intellectuals were not only proud of their knowledge about erotic Chinese novels, but some of them also used erotic novels as textbooks in order to learn and improve their Chinese language proficiency. The Kyokute Baken was the first person to produce a Japanese version of Jinping Mei. Baken was one of the most famous Edo period novelists. He had adapted well-known Chinese novels, including Shui Hu Duan and San Guo Yan Yi, and most of his works were much sought after at the time, but his adaptation of Jinping Mei was not as successful. Baken's Jinping Mei was published in 10 volumes, intermittently over 16 years. In his translation, he not only changed the names of the protagonists into Japanese names, but he also deleted what he considered as salacious descriptions and replaced these with an explicit theme of reward and retribution. He believed that stories about promiscuity would encourage immoral and licentious behavior and thus should be avoided in novels. As such, paratextually, Baken included a preface for each of his 10 volumes of Jinping Mei to elaborate on his censure of the Chinese novel. In his prefaces, he expressed his disagreement with the juxtaposition of Jinping Mei with the other masterworks of the Ming Dynasty. And using epithets very typical of Confucian preaching, Baken commented that Jinping Mei is not appropriate to be read and discussed between the emperor and his subjects or between father and son. As a starting point for shaping interpretation, Baken's prefaces would have been the first element readers encountered in the adaptation of Jinping Mei. And this firmly established Jinping Mei's reputation as a novel no gentleman would consider reading in Japan. Since the late Edo period, censorship in Japan increasingly became a social reality, and this hindered the literary expression of sexuality. In the Meiji period, the government enforced much harsher censorship, and the laws such as the publication law and the press law, censors were authorized to prohibit sales of obscene materials, and also to punish the publishers and the producers of such materials. Since then, all adult content had to be censored or self-censored in Japan. And during the Taisho period, even literary works with only implicit and metaphorical reference to sexuality were prohibited from circulation. 红楼梦 and 西厢记, for example, both had their Japanese translation banned soon after their publication in 1916. Several Japanese versions of Jinpingmei appeared during the Meiji and Taisho periods. But due to the literary censorship, all of them took measures to downplay the sexual descriptions. Nevertheless, not everyone can evade the censors by preemptively self-censoring their own translation. For example, the translation by Xia Jingwei and Masafumi Yamada was banned almost immediately after its publication in 1925. There are a few quite unique features about this translation. It is the first Japanese version that was promoted as a complete translation of Jinpingmei, even though the one-volume translation covers only 22 chapters out of 100 of the Chinese source text. It is also the first and only translation of Jinpingmei that was collaboratively produced by Chinese and Japanese translators. The translators also deleted the provoking erotic scenes of the source text. However, the editorial devices, as you can see from the picture, they used to expurgate the source text may have highlighted the erotic nature of the novel, and indeed foregrounded the censorial context of Japan, which might have irritated the censors to jump to its prohibition. So instead of deleting the sexual descriptions from their target text, as you can see here, the translators decided to replace them with the editorial symbol as a clear indication of deletion. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the defeated Japan was occupied by the US-led Allied forces. Literary publication was in large part liberated from pre-war suppressions. And this gave rise to a most diverse range of translations of Jinpingmei across all media forms. After World War II, for the first time in Japan, a genuinely complete translation. So previously, the one by Xia Jingwei was also claimed to be a complete translation. But the first genuinely complete translation of Jinpingmei only appeared after the Second World War and produced by Shinobu Ono and Koichi Chida. The first volume of their complete translation of Jinpingmei was published in September 1948. But the full version of their translation did not appear until 1960. While Ono and Chida tried to make their translation live up to the label of a complete translation, they had a difficult decision to make about the sexual expressions. Some of the sexual scenes, particularly those involving very similar description of genitals and intercourse, were omitted from the translations. But as a way to compensate for their loss, the translators provided the Chinese source text for the omitted sections in the endnotes to each chapter, making the source text very interestingly coexist with the target text in the same textual space. Now, another, I have just gave a few other translations during the post-war period, but try to cover some of the major ones. Another influential Japanese translation of Jinpingmei appeared in 1967. No reprint of this translation seems to exist, but it is uniquely positioned in the translation history of Jinpingmei because of its transmedial influence. Gakuji Ueda translation was not a complete translation, and he endeavors to complement the existing translations of Jinpingmei with a condensed one. And he hoped that this condensed version would appeal to ordinary readers. Indeed, most Japanese readers at the time only knew of the title of Jinpingmei, but not the content. Ueda hoped his translation could help ordinary readers to understand the content of Jinpingmei. And his translation was successful in this regard. not so much through the publication of his textual translations, but through a movie inspired by and adapted from his translation. Following the end of World War II, eroticism penetrated not only into the book market, but also gradually into Japanese cinema, whereas 1967 translation of Jinping Mei soon attracted the attention of Koji Wakamatsu, who was widely known as the most important director to emerge in the genre of kink film or erotic film. Wakamatsu decided to adapt the novel into a film. And when the film was screened in 1968, Jinping Mei was advertised on par with the Arabian Nights as an eternal erotic classic that was cinematized for the first time in history. Following the popularization of the story of Jinping Mei by Wakamatsu, adaptation, the erotic nature and component of Jinping Mei was further underlined in the creative rewritings of Japanese authors. In 1972, Shinji Komada published a new version of Jinping Mei, and he has the following to say about his motivation for writing the book. As you can see from the book title, it's not a translation of Jinping Mei, it's my version of Jinping Mei. I read Jinping Mei repeatedly as I was impressed by its description of different types of women. It became an obsession, and eventually I decided that I wanted to make these women my own. That was the reason I wrote this book. So it's not a translation, and he very explicitly used I wrote this book. Komada was a Chinese studies specialist, and at the time, also a lecturer at Tokyo University. In addition to his teaching and research on Chinese literature, he was also a prolific translator with a special interest in humorous erotic stories from China. Apart from Jinping Mei, he also produced creative rewritings or adaptations of many other well-known Chinese erotica, such as Rou Pu Tuan and Ru Yi Jun Zhuan. Therefore, his rewriting of Jinping Mei was made possible in the 1970s by a more relaxed sociocultural attitude towards erotica. In stark contrast to the previous translations of Jinping Mei, in which translators had to carefully tone down sexual descriptions, Komada actually confessed that he had done the opposite. He said that my version of Jinping Mei keeps the types of women as in the original text and follows the original storyline, but all the other sexual descriptions are my own creations. From Wakamatsu's film adaptation to Komada's attempt to make the women in Jinping Mei his own, Jinping Mei was increasingly integrated into the Japanese popular culture. It was now regarded not as a subject to be faithfully translated, but as an object to be practically repurposed. It is perhaps not possible to discuss Jinping, the Japanese popular culture, without referring to manga. With Japan being one of the world's major producers of pornography, and Jinping Mei being an infamous erotic classic, the sexual elements of Jinping Mei would naturally become the focus of manga adaptations. Depending on the subgenre, or rather the target audience for different comics, Jinping Mei was appropriated from various angles. Masako Watanabe, for example, is an accomplished Japanese manga artist. She was famous for authoring manga for teenage girls, but later turned to creating more sexually explicit works for adult women in the 1980s. Among these later works was his Jinping Mei series, of which the first story was published in 1993, and the last appeared in 2006. Similarly, there are manga adaptations targeting male readers, exemplified by Shin Mizukami's Another Story from Jinping Mei, published in the BBC series, it's a B-Boy Comics in 2004. This is published in a monthly magazine of yaoi manga, or boys' love, a genre featuring homoerotic relationships between male characters. Generally speaking, these manga versions use all kinds of descriptive terms pointing to the erotic nature and content of Jinping Mei. In the paratext, for example, the covers, the belly bands, and the web pages, in order to maximize the marketing effectiveness. The actual pictorial elements, while catering to their own target readers' tastes, demonstrate, however, very different features, testifying to their respective sociocultural contexts. For a very long time in Japan, genitalia and pubic hair were deemed the only non-representable areas. And practically anything else, including naked breasts, scenes of rape and nudity, were permissible in print or multimodal media. Yamagami's 1988 manga version of Jinping Mei follows the common practice of covering the private parts by using bokashi, which is blurring or fogging, as shown in the photo on the left. But since the late 1980s, censorship on pubic hair has become less stringent. In the early 1990s, nude pictures showing pubic hair already became too commonplace in Japan to be appealing. So in the various Jinping Mei themed manga adaptations after the 1990s, bokashi was no longer used to cover the character's private parts. It is quite undeniable that manga has significantly expanded the reader base of Jinping Mei in Japan. Mami Takezaki immensely successful manga adaptation first appeared in the form of a serialized publication in a magazine. And it was so popular that it was later released in book format. When the 11th volume of the book was published in May 2009, the publishers announced on the belly band that 400,000 copies of the manga had been sold. But in less than 1 year, the belly band of the 13th volume, as you can see from the picture, which was published in April 2010, suggested that the sales figure had reached 500,000 copies. As a popular and accessible format of popular culture, manga is undoubtedly an effective way to inform the wider Japanese public of the content of Jinping Mei. However, since manga adaptations are necessarily appropriations rather than translations of the Chinese novel, readers may be misled as to the nature and content of the original. For example, manga versions typically create some new characters and new sexual adventures that did not exist in the Chinese source text of Jinping Mei. But on the other hand, of course, accuracy of the story or faithfulness to the source text is probably never the major concern of the consumers of popular culture. The manga adaptation, therefore, should not be judged on the basis of how well they present the source stories, but how well they interact with their respective target contexts and target readerships. Due to Jinping Mei's reputation as an erotic classic, its journey into Japanese is first and foremost conditioned by the attitude towards sexuality in the target culture, as reflected in the status of censorship at different historical periods. In other words, what is textual? That is textual features of translation. So what is textual can always be interpreted by future generations of readers as sociocultural. When examined diachronically, particularly, the different ways in which Jinping Mei was translated and adapted provide a clear historical timeline of the vicissitude of Japanese censorship of sexuality. Translations are tied to their historical context and should therefore be examined at once textually and contextually in research. There are many more different versions that can be discussed, but due to the time limit, I think I'll stop here. Back to you, Marija.
Thank you so much, Rick and Shani, for presenting the book, for giving us an overview of the whole book, and explaining how it works, and what were the reasons behind its organization. And then thank you, Rick, for picking our interest with your more in-depth presentation of one of the chapters, specifically the Japanese translations of JPM and its history, and how it worked throughout different periods. That was really both interesting and I'm sure it stimulated a lot of interest among our participants.